Hello again. I'm Dr. Joya Osmond with the Institute for the Humanities. I apologize, we just had a technical glitch and now we are back. But in case you're just joining us now, or just to get us back on track, I'm here with Dr. Christian Flo, who is a postdoctoral fellow at USC at the Society of Fellows in the Humanities. And I'm also here with Dr. Paul Babinski, who is a researcher with the European Koran Project at the University of Copenhagen. Both of these presenters had just talked to me about their specific research projects. They both work on issues of creating knowledge and language, at least in terms of dictionaries and different kinds of languages and how people were able to learn languages like Greek or Latin or Persian or Arabic and able to keep up with the texts that were originally written in those languages. And so both look also at knowledge acquisition and even the history of the university itself. So where we were when we left off is I had just asked both of these people, what are the humanities in the first place? And Dr. Babinski was just answering that question and talking about how the humanities really is the creation of human knowledge. And he was talking about how on one hand, the humanities have existed practically forever. People have been creating art and language and asking important questions for a very long time all around the globe. But on the other hand, the humanities is something that was a 19th century creation. Paul, why don't you take it from there?
Well, I mean, the term itself starts being used in the 19th century, and it's something in the early 20th century, and it's something that's linked to the creation of the modern research university. And so for instance, I was sort of talking about things that we take for granted, but are actually had to be invented, and were invented in particular, very specific circumstances. So the idea that you have homework, the idea that you have a seminar, the idea of what you're supposed to do when you sit in a lecture, the idea that there are these a bunch of these things called disciplines, and that they guarantee that the people who study within those disciplines have expert knowledge. So for instance, how do you know that what I'm saying is true and that I'm not just making it up? Well, I have a PhD from a reputable university. And if I were to apply for a job, a bunch of people would write for me, mentors and colleagues, who would explain the quality of my work. And that's all something that belongs to the discipline. And these are all, in part, rituals that we invented in the 19th century. And so the humanities emerged out of this world. And in particular, in a kind of a different context than maybe what we think of as the humanities today were understood as before, because at that point, the opposition was really the opposition between what they would call the humanities, or the Geisteswissenschaften in German, and the natural sciences. And so maybe, I don't know if Christian, if you want to jump in here. And
yeah, no, I mean, I like the way Paul put it. I mean, what can I say? I might pick up the sort of old new tension, which I think is actually pretty useful. I mean, if we want to talk about old, we can follow the terminology back, right? So to be humanos, or to evince humanitas in antiquity in Latin, right, doesn't just mean, you have a body and you can breathe. It has this extra connotation in many instances of being educated, of cultivating those faculties which are somehow most essentially human, namely the ability to educate yourself, to be able to speak well, to be familiar with literature and culture, of cultivating those capacities to the fullest. And so obviously, I mean, we can see the connection, at least as a substrate to our current understanding of the term humanities. 15th, 16th century, you get the Studia Humanitatis, which is comprised of grammar, rhetoric, poetry, Greek and Latin literature, moral philosophy. I mean, you see the common denominator here. So what a humanista, as they would call it, slang-wise, in a 15th century university was studying, there's some connection there. You can see somebody reading Cicero as part of the Studia Humanitatis the same way a 20th century humanities student might be reading Cicero. Yeah, I think it's extremely important that what Paul says, the idea that the humanities per se are, a creation of the last 150 years, that's also essential, right? And so I think the key difference here is what he got to at the end is, what are you defining yourself against, right? How do you see the map of knowledge and where you sit on it? And so, first century CE, sure, you've got humanitas, sure, people are reading texts, but the way you think about the way knowledge is divided up is not between, the natural sciences and literary studies, right? You're going to think maybe more in terms of the 7 liberal arts, right? 15th century, you might be a doctor, who's interested in pharmacology, and spend all your time reading, Theophrastus or reading Galen or reading classical texts, right? And not actually in the field, gathering samples. So this idea that there's a stark opposition between people who study, to take up the guys who study the products of the human mind and those who study nature is the new creation of, the late 19th century.
So if I could just jump in and
Yes.
summarize a little bit what you've been saying.
Yes.
So it kind of sounds like that, on one hand, the humanities just, reading and writing and thinking and all the rest of it has kind of just
Very old.
existed time immemorial, but that depending on where you are in history, what people consider the humanities has kind of changed or shifted in some ways. And that,
Yeah.
So
and
it's
that,
also
and that's,
consistent.
What people
What was
consider
that?
the humanities as opposed to, I think, that
Right.
might be the sort of sharpest way to bring it into focus. And
So the
I
study
like
of Humanitatis is opposed to knowledge of the
maybe
divine.
scholasticism, for instance, right? But I
Right.
like the way Paul sort of materialized it and said, okay, so we have to think about it in terms of a university with departments that belong to the Geisteswissenschaften, and then you have scientists over here who, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, in the German university context, are all of a sudden having laboratories and institutes built for them that cost millions of dollars, millions of marks, right? That is something where you're walking around a German city and you're confronted with that reality that represents the divide materially. And one way to bring into focus, I think, the freshness of that distinction is that you see a lot of activity in the 19th century to try to define the boundary, right? And this is where I think we have to cite some names for people who might be interested in doing reading. I find this stuff rather tedious, but if you're interested, Dilthey is a name that gets thrown around a lot, and he's the one where he's saying, okay, we have the Geisteswissenschaften, and that deals with the products of the human mind, and that's defined by a particular methodology, and it is theoretically and practically different from what's going on in the natural sciences. Wilhelm Windelband is another one. He says, okay, what they're doing in a scientific laboratory, they're finding laws. They're doing nomothetic operations that are concerned with generating overriding laws of nature, and that's something very different than we do when we read texts.
So are you saying that these intellectuals in 19th century German universities were purposely separating the sciences from the humanities at that point and creating it as a distinct field?
They are looking to theorize the different identities of the humanist as opposed to the natural scientist specifically, which is something that has not really been done previously. You can look at precursors, maybe something like Vico, more than a century earlier, but to have it done in that sort of a sheer theorized, philosophized way, and to see that issue in the reality of brick and mortar on a university campus, that's something new. Is that fair, Paul?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that there's like a 20th century equivalent. So we talk about the two cultures and C.P. Snow.
The
and
two
like,
cultures.
Right. How do and it's we associate it with particular problems, like how do we get engineers to read Plato? Like how do we get philosophers to have some understanding of like the science that affects their lives? This is something that's a legacy of the 19th century.
Well, first of all, we have some comments coming in already on our Facebook page, and I forgot to mention at the beginning, but if you do have a question for our presenters, or if you do have a comment that you want to bring into the conversation, don't be shy. Please write that in the comments section underneath the video, and I'll do my best to incorporate it as we go. Because, I mean, you're talking kind of about this very kind of academic definition of humanities and it being defined against the sciences and things like that starting in the 19th century. But I have a comment here from a fellow humanist, Max Orr, who works at the Institute for the Humanities at UNC Chapel Hill. And he says that he thinks of the humanities also as a mode of inquiry predicated upon dialogue and reflection. These humanistic skills can be applied to a number of disciplines. So in the 19th century, even, are these scientists also practicing the humanistic disciplines despite themselves, even though they're trying to kind of separate away because they're still asking questions?
Yeah, I think that's a very... I'm trying to think about how to come at this. That's a very useful comment for the following reason. Historians of science, there's a signal book in the history of science, which I very much like, and it's called Laboratory Life. And what happens in this book is that there's two sort of sociologists of science, come historians of science, who embed themselves in a laboratory where what are they doing? It's in France. They're synthesizing proteins, maybe, or something like that. And they look at it as if they're anthropologists coming to a foreign land, and they say everything that goes on there. And the bottom line is, at the end, they come to some conclusions. One of those conclusions is that, okay, when these scientists in the lab are actually generating conclusions and saying, we know X about proteins, we know Y about proteins, what that looks like is them moving papers, moving texts around on a desktop and trying to generate a persuasive argument out of those texts. And so what they say is, actually, it's useful to think about the prototype of natural scientific activity as being, not mathematics or logic, perhaps, but interpretation, exegesis, argumentation, right? These fundamental skills that we often actually put under the umbrella of the humanities. The bottom line being that, exactly as the commentator says, the natural scientists, for all the sort of distinctions that we're now familiar with from the 19th century, are very much imbricated with humanistic practices. And what's currently going on is an attempt to write not just the history of science per se. Historians are trying not to write just, okay, the history of the lab, the history of the field site, the history of the particle accelerator, but to generate a more far-reaching history of knowledge that shows how cultures that are concerned with making sense out of text and literature are actually tied in surprising ways with practitioners who are trying to make sense out of nature. So, yeah. Paul,
So humanities wins, yay!
Yeah, I always like to say it's like trying to write the history of science per se as something that's hived off is like trying to, clap with one hand. I mean, it doesn't, science comes, if historians of science have taught us anything, right, it's that, science is created in a frame of politics, of ethics, of priorities, right? And, these are things that the humanities has just as much of a claim on, so.
So I mean, because it almost sounds like, what you're saying is that, and by the way, you do mean history is part of the humanities, right, Christian?
Sure.
Yes. Okay. I've got another comment saying, Christian, you left out history.
Sorry. Yes.
Yes, that's all right. But it kind of sounds like that even though these folks are trying to kind of separate science as a distinct discipline, they're using the humanities to do it. And it's still, they need each other in order to exist. And Paul, I know you're trying to jump in.
Yeah, just to hop in on a point that I think that the commentator's observation is something that really is linked to pedagogical problems of the present. And I think that we are asking this question about, in universities, what it is that humanities are offering. And one answer to that is that there are distinct forms of humanist reasoning that are relevant to fields outside of the humanities. That is to say, you become an engineer, well, just how you think through problems, how you interact with people that you work with, how you understand the implications of the work that you do, are all things that would be mediated by the kind of knowledge or humanistic reasoning that one would be able to get from from humanities fields. But on the other hand, a lot of what we do in terms of looking at the history of the humanities is looking at an enterprise that is like deeply positivist, and that is about really there are elements of interpretation, but there's also just a lot of accumulation of knowledge. And so to read the text and to be able to interpret a text in, say, Turkish in the 17th century implies having access to not just one manuscript, but a whole library of sources that you would have to be able to piece together and make sense of using very distinct methods that you would probably learn in very specific places that can be identified. And so a lot of what we're doing is just kind of figuring out how it is that happens. And so there's like, I would just say that, like, I think that this all belongs to the kind of discourse of the humanities of the present, but just to emphasize that, like, talking about the history of the humanities, looking back on, say, the 17th or the 18th century, it's kind of like a paper maze, and we're sort of trying to find our way through it and sort of reconstruct things that we know happened, we just don't know how they happened.
And when you're talking about things that happen, you're just not sure how, are you talking about thought processes or theories, things like that, kind of mental approaches?
Yeah, we should get into some of the sources, probably, Paul.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Because I think, well, I'll turn it over to you in a sec, Paul. But I mean, I think that the biggest misconception that one can make is, okay, you know, what does the humanities look like? What is the work of a philologist or a textual scholar looks like? Well, it looks like them sitting at a desk reading a book, right? And maybe occasionally dropping a note and then throwing it away when they're done with it, right? How do you write the history of that?
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I guess Paul, like, so some of what we do, I suppose, is travel around and try to find sources that actually fill out that picture substantially.
Yeah.
And Paul tends to have better archive war stories than I do. So
I don't know if
what
that's
kind of stuff have you? I mean, what are some of like the great archive finds that you've experienced in this connection?
okay. So I would say like one thing that's I think particular to the history of scholarship or the history of the humanities, and really when we say history of the humanities, this is a kind of new label that where people are putting on sort of after the success of the history of science as sort of as a discipline for a bunch of little branches of the history of scholarship, and we have a kind of privileged relationship to historical objects that is I think really special. So like if you were to say be looking, you know, at a museum at like the I don't know the pistol that Aaron Burr used to shoot Alexander Hamilton, like fiddling around with that pistol isn't going to help you understand the history of you know early American history or anything like that. And it's the exact opposite in the history.
The American historian.
Yeah, right. I don't
Oh,
know.
American historian.
American historian typing in right now. No, as a matter of fact, you know, material culture is very important to understanding history. Tread lightly, folks.
But the so but when we look at the notebook of a scholar, that notebook tells us not just what they knew, but it's an introduction into their world. And so Christian was asking about like the kind of great archival finds, and like I mean, there are a lot of ways to think of like you know that experience and what makes something exceptional. But I remember once I was in Copenhagen and I was looking at the archive of the 18th century's 18th century Western Europe's greatest Arabist. And there's this real mystery of how did this guy become the best scholar of his generation and really the best scholar of his century and 100 years ahead of anybody else. And he didn't actually publish much, and everything was in manuscripts. And so you have to kind of dig through the manuscripts and you find stuff. And I was going through like notes, like just these little like kind of notes that he had written that were going to become footnotes in a major edition that he never published, but he almost completed. And I found a little slip of paper where he's noting the things that are not like he's just sort of noting things about the edition and things about the author. And then about halfway through, he just turns the whole thing on himself and he starts talking about his failures. And he starts listing his failures. He says, my Latin's not good enough. I don't know Turkish. When they're talking about this, you know, these religious rites, I don't know what they mean, you know, and he goes on like that. And it's a remarkable moment where the sort of the experience of this person, the mental experience of this person, sitting in this room in 18th century Leipzig, working with these manuscripts, really comes into view, and you just sort of see how he felt and experienced that world.
Yeah, yeah, and and I think I guess a key thing to note, so that we don't get too far ahead of ourselves, is just that we're not kind of pulling this Appalachian history of humanities out, out of our back pockets. This is something we just do by happenstance. It's worthwhile to just contextualize it by saying that, in the last 20, 30 years, and currently, I think it's fair to say that Mississippi State is one of the great centers of this kind of activity. Historians of science, identified as such and considering themselves as such, has created very sort of rich contextualized pictures of what goes on inside the laboratory. How does a particle accelerator work? Who are the sort of invisible agents that lurk behind the published authors of these scientific papers? How could it have been otherwise? What are the contingencies that we miss when we say, oh, science goes from A to B to C? What are the cultures that support scientific inquiry in the first place? And this very impressive sort of armature and set of analytical categories have been built up to analyze the creation of knowledge around the natural world. And currently, I think what's happening is that we're seeing an attempt to define a field identified as the history of humanities to kind of give us the yang to that yin, as it were.
Yes.
And what does that mean? I mean, it means that there's currently in the last 10 years a lot of international conferences that are specifically devoted to the history of the humanities. There's a journal called The History of the Humanities that's been just launched in the last 4 or 5 years. There's postdocs and doctoral students and professorial chairs in Europe, specifically in the Netherlands, that are devoted to this. And so this is a field in some sense on the make, and again, there's a little bit of a new old tension here, but it's a field in some sense on the make. And what I think when Paul talks about what are we doing in the archives, I mean, part of what we're doing is trying to define the parallel methodology to the approaches adopted by historians of science that will allow us to tell the same kinds or analogous or parallel or intertwined histories of scholars of texts. And, so finds like, the notebook of, a 17th century Ottoman scholar, that's the kind of source from which you can actually start to build up a three-dimensional picture and say, oh, you know what? This isn't just a guy sitting at his desk. Actually, his household was crucial to his ability, to put together a lexicon of X or Y language. Or, Paul, you have this whole thing about, like travelers coming through, right? Who aren't.
Well, this is Leiden 242, which is this wonderful copy of the Golestan of Sa'di, which is a brilliant 13th century Persian text, and it's one of the kind of great works of world literature. And I was trying to figure out how these people in Leiden, which is kind of the center of learned Europe in the 17th century, were
And which
reading.
is in the Netherlands, right?
It's the Netherlands, yeah.
Yeah.
And we knew that they were suddenly around like 1630s, 1640s, they were suddenly turning to Persian literature and reading it. We didn't really know a lot about how that happened. And somebody had actually recommended to me to look at this manuscript, and they said that it was that had the notes of Scaliger. And I looked at it. It was an earlier scholar in Leiden. And I looked at it, and it was just layers, like a palimpsest of readers. There's
Right.
layers and layers of readers. None of them Scaliger. But what it was is mostly, so it was a Turkish scholar who worked through the text and added excerpts from earlier commentaries that were written in Turkish or in Arabic, and then this Dutch Orientalist who's working with his students and with a native Persian speaker who had traveled with an embassy to northern Germany and then from northern Germany to Leiden, was working through this text with a host of other texts. And so you can actually, just by looking at the annotations in this text, you can reconstruct the whole world that the scholar is inhabiting.
Yeah.
The manuscripts they have on their desk, the person that they're asking. We actually have this is the best part. Most of the best archival finds were made in the 19th century, and you just have to find them in the printed literature. And so we actually found the contract between this learned Persian and the Orientalist, and it specifies in detail exactly the kind of work he did. So we can actually say a lot just by piecing together these little annotations with the printed sources, with the archival finds like this contract.
Right. I guess maybe the way to put it is like the same way, a lab notebook from the 19th century can attest, to a whole unseen world of people who don't appear in the printed publications, of epistemological stops and starts that are largely effaced in the literature that results. So too, a notebook full of literary notes can, attest to all these characters that you wouldn't know about otherwise. They can attest to the domestic work that's being done to support knowledge creation. Can attest to the false alleyways that people have followed. All of that is there. Sometimes you'll see generational enterprises in the pages of these books, as father passes the book to daughter or to son, and you'll see like actually an intergenerational conversation playing out in the margins. And all of that is part of this sort of granular reconstruction of what when we say we know something about a classical text, when we say we know something about a language, what does that mean, and what's the process that sits behind that? Yeah.
Can I actually jump in on something that you said earlier, Christian? Because I think it's important. Is like the new old distinction when talking about the history of the humanities.
Yeah.
It really is like there's an attempt to kind of found a field, and also to
I knew you were gonna zing me on this. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean like to make intelligible all of these different sort of histories of disciplines and histories of scholarship. But what we do, I mean, it's really astounding. And I think you realize that first, and both Christian and I know this very well from our own research, when you're going and just trying to track stuff down, is that the history of scholarship is old. And often the best people, the people you learn the most from, were these like provincial Germans in the early 18th century.
High school teachers.
Yeah, high school teachers. The people who just sought out all of these manuscripts and then wrote them up. And so, for instance, like there's a great 18th century source that lists for German writers not just everything that they published, not just the things that they mentioned, but the things they promised. And so the things that they said that they were going to write eventually, or maybe that they had started writing. And so when you have that kind of information, sometimes from people who've actually seen the manuscripts, it's a guide basically to what you find when you're looking through libraries and archives.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's well put. I mean, we
Yeah.
always joke that the best way to say something new in the history of scholarship is to read somebody who was doing the history of scholarship 300 years ago.
Right, right.
And then basically write that in English.
Well,
But those are trade secrets.
yeah. Well, if I could jump in, we've got a number of questions on Facebook. If you have a question, please don't be shy. Please pose it. We have a number of questions coming in and some conversation pieces. So somebody went ahead and did put in the link to the journal for the history of the humanities that you were talking about earlier,
Fantastic,
Christian.
yes.
So thank you very much to Rens Bod for doing that.
Yeah, Rens Bod.
You're in good company.
Fantastic. That is.
Yes, and then we also have a few observations, and I'm just gonna put them out there, and you can kind of pick which ones you want to comment on next. We have one observation about methodologies between science and the humanities, and that people who do science like to see everything as being very measurable. Everything they do is measurable, whereas the humanities is less concerned with having metrics to go with what they do. So that's one thing. Another person has a great question about like the what we would think of now as the social sciences, where those come into this discussion of kind of, you know, how science, like a hard distinct science came out of the humanities, and the humanities is now taking from history of science to have a history of the humanities. So where does sociology or anthropology, for example, emerge as disciplines in this kind of science humanities soup that we've been talking about? And then the last question I want to throw out there, just to give you all food for thought and things to talk about, is about the politics of separating the science from the humanities. And I'll just read the rest of the question. There's been a move in recent years to really de-emphasize the humanities in favor of the STEM majors, driven in part by the idea that the humanities are inherently leftist, or it poisons young minds in some way that math and science don't. Is this a new issue, or just the latest iteration of a controversy that pops up periodically in the politics of higher ed? So you have a lot to play with there. So I don't know if you want to speak to science measuring versus the humanities not so much, or anthropology and social sciences and where they fit, or this question of politics.
I'll speak really quickly to a couple of those things, and then maybe pass it to Paul. First of all, thanks for posting the link. And I would encourage, like, the answer to some of these questions, the best place to start would be by reading the 5 or 6 annual volumes of the history of humanities that there have been so far, because a lot of these questions are being sort of very actively worked with. This question about sort of the methodological distinctions between the humanities and the natural sciences, and whether sort of whether sort of quantification, for instance, is something that doesn't sort of get across the corridor. First of all, I'd say that, like, this sort of foray into trying to substantiate a methodological distinction is it puts whoever asked this question, in a 2-century line of people who are trying to actually, like, find the key that will successfully segregate and neatly segregate these supposedly different areas of pursuit. What I would say real quickly to this, and Rens Bod is actually great on this, is that part of the challenge, if we're trying to write humanities and the natural sciences together, is finding an analytical stratum where the particularities of either kind of don't get in the way. And so maybe instead of looking at quantification per se, you look at something like practices of collection, right? You have to find sort of moments of analysis that do line up in either one, and that helps you start to get a handle on what is the same and what is different. The problem is that you obviously can point to examples of quantification in fields like history, in fields like literary studies. One of the guys I study, a 19th century philologist by the name of Wöflin, is very obsessed with counting just how many how many instances of certain words there are in certain texts, and trying to define the sort of textual physiognomy of an author by saying how many times they use the ablative absolute. There's a lot of numbers involved, in fact. So yeah, Paul, do you want to
I mean,
chime
I
in
would
on
say,
any of that?
the point of measurables is interesting because, I mean, this is a feature of philology in different cultures and throughout history. I mean, not just, assigning number values to words and then using that to make calculations that might have sort of, predict, interpret omens, or foresee the future, but also just like the most detail-oriented work that you could possibly imagine. That stuff happens in the exact sciences, but a lot of it happens in philology. And those people, I mean, and the people who do it are as detail-oriented as you could possibly imagine. And I think, again, like, it's really important to not underestimate. I think, for the present just as much as for the past, it's a positivistic enterprise on some basic level, where people are working through processing things, they're accumulating knowledge, and they're doing very specific operations that can be reconstructed from written records.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting case study. I'll just say real quickly, the case of quantification is an interesting case study that points to why we need to be a little bit more ecumenical in our treatments of the history of knowledge, right? So if you write a study of a lab scientist, and there's a lot of numbers in it, and you say, okay, well, he's using a lot of numbers, and quantification is something that belongs to the natural scientist. Great, but if you widen your lens, you can start to see how a practice like quantification is actually being passed back and forth between what we think of as different disciplines, between people who are working on different kinds of sources. And so once you sort of widen that lens, you see that a lot of these methodologies that we considered perhaps off the top of our heads to be particular of one area of pursuit, one arena of pursuit or another, are actually sort of interlaced and are being passed back and forth.
Yeah.
Paul, do you want to talk about liberal humanists?
I mean,
we get to that.
I was just going to sum up real quick. So, I mean, it kind of sounds like what you're saying is that, the humanities isn't just reading texts and thinking abstractly, and science isn't just pure quantification, that there's a lot of passing back and forth of different methodologies between different kinds of fields, and that plenty of humanists use quantifications in their studies as well.
Right. What we're learning is that, like, we need to be very careful about deciding that any given methodology, any given practice is the particular province of a particular discipline or set of practitioners. That's what we're learning.
Yeah, and you better be careful, Christian, because someone is starting to cite your work in the chat, and giving everyone a handy reference of something you wrote called philological observation.
There's not very much of it. That's for sure.
Well, 30 pages apparently. And then if I could just jump in as well. So is this kind of, you're talking about quantification going back, or the various methodologies involving quantification kind of being traded around, and that it doesn't just belong to one discipline or another. Is this where we see things emerge like anthropology or social sciences?
Good question.
Yeah.
Right. So real quickly, I mean, the emergence of the social sciences, it's a tertium quid. It doesn't sit very easily in our sort of bilateral, heuristic about natural sciences and the humanities right now. And it didn't sit very comfortably in the 19th century. There's actually like a decent paper, I think, about how the rise and the increasing prominence of the social sciences, of population sciences, demographic, things like that, is actually like one of the driving factors that leads theorists of the Geisteswissenschaften versus the Naturwissenschaften to try to work out that distinction, because you all of a sudden have this sort of third factor that doesn't seem to fit nicely in either camp, that isn't necessarily represented in the academies, that doesn't necessarily like have a lot of professorial chairs allotted to it. And so I guess the short answer to this is, those sort of new sort of hybrid disciplines, as it were, are a consistent feature that drives the discourse about, how do we divide up this map of knowledge that Paul began with.
Can I actually jump in on the point about the politics of humanism and the humanities?
Please.
So I would say, like, one thing that the history of the humanities teaches us is that these things are not static. And, even if you think about it today, like, we have different associations with different approaches to the humanities, with sort of different places on the political spectrum. So one might think of a kind of something more quote unquote traditional, which isn't always actually as traditional as one thinks, of like the Great Books program as being more conservative. One might think about like studying, I don't know, gender studies or something like that as being part of a leftist political project. And these things don't always hold up. And if you look back in the past, the interest in gender and sexuality is obviously runs the gamut of different orthodoxies and interests and political affiliations. And I think at the same time, like a lot of the most important scholars, philologists, historians have been, I mean, when you get into their politics, there's a lot of difference, and you can't necessarily make assumptions about where it is that they stand, and some of them are often politically active in a way that exceeds their work, and often people do. I mean, the kind of great example is Marachi's edition and translation of the Quran, which is one of the closest examinations in the 17th century of both the Quranic text and of the commentary tradition around it, but is clothed in this kind of interest in orthodoxy and refutation. So it's about, and on one level, it's the most sort of engaged philological interest in the Quranic text, and at the same time it's particularly interested in this question about divergences with the Bible or what might be refuted, or et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that I think that if one has associations of the present, I mean, there's often good reasons and complicated reasons for these things. But if anything, the history teaches us, it's that these things don't line up in any way.
Yeah, well put, I think. Yeah. I think universities, they have this kind of igneous quality. I mean, that and they go up and down in their political persuasions. I mean, you have universities being started in the early modern period in a lot of cases by sort of regents who want to staff their bureaucracies with loyal and capable servants. And then, these universities, people are talking, people are reading, and all of a sudden you've got hotbeds of dissent. So, whoever posed the question, I think ultimately put it well, which is that, this goes up and down. The political persuasions and the way that it's aligned societally, I think is kind of sinusoidal.
If I could stay on this topic, but I'm just going to incorporate a comment that came in from someone while you guys were just speaking, and kind of bringing things back up to the present day a little bit. We have a comment that says, what's different today from the CP Snow dichotomy is a general distrust of expertise in both the sciences and the humanities. And he continues, the cure for this can only come from the humanities, in my opinion. Can the scholars, that's you guys, comment on this general trend of negativity towards the academy and expertise in general? And how can the humanities help regain public confidence? Fix the problem, guys. Go for it.
So if I can jump in, I think that sometimes I don't disagree. I think that the question of expertise is a really important one. But I think that like we can also look at all of the ways in which we really do have a real deference to expertise, and we do trust people who know what they're talking about or who we perceive as knowing what they're talking about. But there is, I mean, if we're talking about the sort of proliferation of conspiracy theories and things like that, and just the tendency to deny everything, I think that that's true. And I think that there's, particularly in the humanities, there's a challenge with the question of what our authority or intellectual authority actually is. And it's an interesting one that relates to the organization of the humanities, because I think it's fair to say that traditionally that relates to disciplines and to the relationship between institutions and the individuals that train there. That is to say, sort of like I said before, how do you know I know what I'm talking about? I really could just be making all of this up. All of these references could just be inventions out of my mind. But one assumes that I have a certain set of rules that I follow. And also one assumes that I have a certain amount of level of training that relates to the place that I studied, the people that I studied with, and the discipline that I studied with or studied within. And that disciplinarity has an important function in granting this authority. And so one challenge, it's a real challenge of like, if we're, instead of having a bunch of different departments that are saying we have a German department and a French department, and we have a real clear understanding of anybody that comes from these departments, what they know, whether or not that works, but I mean, just, in the aggregate, if we get rid of those, then what is just a general humanities program guarantee about the person that comes from it? Or what does if it's just literature, what does that mean? And I think that there's an effort that has to go not just into sort of defining that disciplinarity and maintaining it in some real way, like having standards for what people know and what people are able to do, but also in communicating what that means to a general public.
Yeah. I think the questioner has put their finger on something like very astutely. And it's this sort of ironic thing where, there's this sort of conventional administrative wisdom. I think that, okay, well, we should allocate resources towards, areas of study that are eminently useful, that are, current, primary, profitable, um, and, impactful. And you say, okay, well, reading Dickens, doesn't make an mRNA vaccine for you. It doesn't put, a probe on Mars. That doesn't happen that way. But by the same token, and this is what the questioner is getting at, is that, the idea that somehow the humanities, or the not sciences, as it were, are not, somehow primary and impactful and even existential is, just doesn't hold water. I mean, you just have to look around. It's, you've got the governor, talking about what history curricula and moving millions of dollars around on that question. We've got a crisis of trust in the country. We've got debates about things like how statues signify, whether they should stand or not. We've got questions about what America has been and what the bearing of that should be on what it can and should be. And I think again, it's put well in the question. These are answers that like a white lab coat doesn't provide.
But
So
can I just, I
yeah.
mean, just to emphasize the point again, though, I really do think that we trust experts more than we sometimes think we do. And so, for instance, you get these fascinating, like one of the most fascinating forms of discourse in the present is the historian that sort of dunks on people on Twitter. And will just, somebody makes some error or says something that's wrong or ridiculous, and then they sort of jump in with a big long thread.
Yeah.
And I think that, the fascination with that, and that as a form of debate, right, of back and forth, I rest on a real understanding that there's something called historical expertise.
Yeah.
Or that there is some kind of right answer out there. There is some kind of a truth or some kind of factual piece out there, and we're all kind of trying to find it.
Yeah, and I mean, just to start to like getting to something that like resembles an actual answer. I mean, Paul, I've heard you say this before, right? Like, one of the ways you can kind of frame or begin to imagine a quote unquote solution to the problem of expertise is to somehow create more, buy-in, right? To bring down the walls between the university and not the university. And Paul, I've heard you say this before, where like maybe the university needs to think in terms, of should not be thinking in terms of, how do I justify what I offer to the community, but to somehow open the doors and have the community come to me and say what it wants, what I can do for it. I mean, am I representing that
Yeah.
aptly?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think it goes to this really broad question. I think probably everybody in the chat, like everybody who's here, is sort of dealing with it right now. Of like, the humanities are changing. The way that we teach is changing. The way that our institutions function is changing, and it's not clear in 20 years like what exactly that's going to look like.
Mhm.
If you just sort of look at the suggestions that people make about how to reorganize curricula, how to organize disciplines, there's a whole range of possibilities that we might sort of enter into. And one of the benefits of the history of the humanities is some sort of level of reflection in that.
Yes.
And I think the really interesting thing is going to what Christian was saying, is what about this world of technology? Of like, we're live streaming right now, and we're doing something that already has a sort of a clear form within the academy. So, a discussion, people are sitting in the audience, and it's a kind of virtual form of that. But there are all sort of forms of communication that are emerging in this pandemic universe that aren't like that. So it just is to frame it in terms of a very concrete question.
Yeah.
Will we live in a world where people do homework on live stream and then other people jump in? Are we going to?
Yeah.
Is anybody going to just work through Virgil on like YouTube and just go from beginning to end and explicate everything? I mean, these are things that I suspect we haven't seen yet, but that we're going to start seeing in the future. And there's an interesting question if we're talking about the function of the university as an institution. Well, is one of those functions to organize those new kind of efforts or products?
Yes, and Paul, I want to float something. So I hear a lot about how our local communities like are being degraded and like nobody knows their neighbor anymore. I see where Ben Sass is saying that like we need to like get out and do some stuff together, and Robert Putnam says, like, none of us are, going to the bowling alleys anymore. And somehow we need to fix that. And, once we come together locally, that somehow, the animosity or the polarization that we believe to ail our nation will start to be alleviated. I think it's interesting and perhaps possible to think about the universities as a kind of nodal infrastructure that is already there, that could be used to encourage those kind of community interactions. And I don't know, there's a long history of sort of town gown enmity, which I think is a real thing. I think a good place to maybe to start addressing both the problem of local and community decay and sort of town gown opposition would be to think about ways that the university can be kind of a community meeting point, can be like these things that we always hear out from the good old days of yore, the bowling league or whatever it is that people are doing. I guess the pickleball club.
If I could jump in on you there, Christian, I'm just going to read a comment that is very pertinent to what you just said from Jennifer Anderson, but then I'm going to pose some questions that have been flowing into Facebook about kind of the history of the humanities discipline itself. So Jennifer Anderson adds to what you were just saying. She says, it is the ability to think, to achieve metacognition, to contribute to the fabric of the global society. It is preservation of the human condition to our shared history. Because you cannot measure those things, and because data means dollars, we will fight for validity. Public school education shows us this clearly. If we cannot make it, I guess the humanities, all of what you're talking about, if we cannot make it a commodity to be bought and sold, then we will be forever asserting ourselves. So, and I have to admit that while I hear you speak, and this is in fact what the Institute for the Humanities is trying to do, if I can take this opportunity to self-advertise a slight bit, is to make all of these kind of university resources available to the larger community and to bring the university, things in touch with the community and in touch with underserved members of our community. That's what I'm trying to do.
Right.
But Jennifer Anderson, Norman, I'm sorry, makes an interesting point that, at some point, we are very much a society based on commodification and based on money and based on how to make that and kind of based on a lot of business models. And so, she warns us that that's an element of it here. I know you want to speak to that, but I'm not going to let you.
Yeah.
Save it because it's just,
I'll mold that.
have a think. And we're kind of reaching the point where we usually start wrapping up, but I'm going to let us go a little longer since we had a technical glitch a bit earlier on. And because there's so many questions that I think deserve to be addressed. Okay. So all of these questions I'm going to throw at you have to do with the kind of nature of the history of the humanities in the first place. And these are questions that came up when we were talking about the nature of this kind of realm of inquiry. So one person reminds us that a lot of what you guys are talking about has to do with the study of texts. And he warns, don't let the study of texts be too dominant. Humanities is also the study of paintings, music, theater, architecture, etc. To this, there's also Judy Ridner, who wrote a good while back saying that she is an historian of material culture, among other things. And she was saying, she says, I've seen fascinating manuscript history of Philadelphia from the early 19th century that includes drawings of buildings and swatches of fabric. How does material culture figure into what you're discussing? So not just texts, shout out to material culture. And then Alex Huey, first Seth Oppenheimer says, where's mathematics in all of this? Good question. And we were just talking about metrics and measuring and quantification and things like that. And I know math is not just that, but numbers are there. And then finally, Alex Huey throws a great question into the mix. And she says, do we see the history of humanities as being led by historians of science, who are themselves humanists to be sure? Is STEM swallowing up the humanities? Or put differently, is this broadening of our definition of science or treating humanities as equivalent on its own terms? So what are we actually doing with this whole, first of all, what's in the history of the humanities beyond just texts? And then second, what are we really doing with this history of the humanities things? Are we kind of, by following the history of science model, are we kind of being incorporated into STEM? Or are we trying to make sure that the humanities are treated as equivalent to science on its own terms?
Mm-hmm.
Now I hand it back to you.
Can I jump in quickly on the
Please.
text?
Please, go for it.
I'm a historian of philology, so that colors what I'm about to just say. But I think that material culture, all of these things are extremely important. I think they're becoming more important now because we can easily photograph things, and I think that there's this whole revolution that's happening in the practice of actual scholarship that has to do with digital photography. And we all go into archives. I know Christian and I both have experienced this, and you just photograph a bunch of things. But that's also true for if you're doing fabrics or things like that. You can create databases of things that before were more difficult to create databases of, and that create the opportunity for comparison that might be useful for dating and might be useful for attribution. This is also true for drawings, for paintings and things like that, though they were more advanced with photographic reproductions in art history and these things in the early 20th century. That said, a remarkable amount of what we know about the past is rooted in text. And I think for that reason that the philology has a privileged place both in the study of the past. I think this is also true for art history, which is based, to a significant extent when you're making attributions, when you're understanding the context and workshop practices of an artist, is rooted in our serious archival work. And I think it's also important for the formation of disciplines that, and this is the kind of James Turner has this book that came out recently on the philology is a forgotten discipline, and kind of thinking of philology as being a kind of origin point for this sort of fracturing of different disciplines in the 19th century.
And I'll also just add, if I can, because this is something that is being discussed a lot, at least in French history, which is my discipline. Kind of this quest or the non-archivable sources. So especially, looking to understand better peoples who had been enslaved, or peoples who had been colonized, or peoples for whom, we don't have a written down record of their voices, but who are nonetheless an incredibly important part of the fabric of history, and the arts and all the rest of it. So there's also kind of this huge attempt right now, I think, within the humanities to get at things that were not written down, that we cannot find any very little, written evidence for. And there's kind of an emphasis on, does the kind of knowledge that we produce scholarship about have to be archivally based, or what kind of other methodologies could we use to try to get at these non-archivable voices? So I'll just throw that in there to the mix. But Christian, I know that you want to jump in on this too.
Oh yeah, I guess I'll just take a couple pieces. I mean, first of all, like real quickly on material culture. I mean, material culture I think is essential. And I would like nothing better than a good piece about how the layout and furniture of a 19th century study conditions and contours the work that's being done there and the identity of the one doing it. How's a library laid out? What does a book smell like when you open it? How all of this sort of dimensions the identity and the sort of range of possibilities of the scholar. Material culture has a huge role to play, in short. This is very much, I think, at this point, about practice and about creating granular three-dimensional pictures of how scholarship is created. So this question, I guess, which I take to be, whether taking history of science as a model for the history of the humanities is somehow tantamount to, how would I say it? Reifying the common sense primacy of the STEM disciplines by kind of bringing up the train, now reenacting in history this common sense idea that somehow humanities brings up the train of the sciences. I think it's this is a complicated question. I mean, I think that there are those that see the history of the humanities as a bolstering enterprise that is very much geared towards shoring up the primacy of the humanities and showing how robustly they're sort of intertwined with everything that we do. Yeah.
No, I think it's really interesting.
It's
just to think about it kind of in the way academia works, right? Is because we're constantly trying to, like, in the very fact, and this goes back to Jennifer Anderson Norman's comment about the commodification of knowledge, is just that, to a degree, because we are in a university structure and because the university structure is governed by, at least at the State of Mississippi state government, or a board of governors or a board of visitors, or how well the endowment's doing. I mean, all of that kind of governs what the university can and can't do. And then someone high at the top has to decide how to allocate certain resources in one direction or the other, right? So I feel like within the academy, so to speak, we're constantly kind of jostling each other a little bit to be like, oh no, me, yeah, I should get the grant, I should get the dollars, I should get the position, my department should get the chair, or whatever the thing is. And I've seen this happen even in military history, which is also my field, where for a while it looked like traditional military history was kind of going by the wayside, and fewer jobs are open for traditional military historians or those who do operational military history. And then so, they start to reinvent themselves as, oh no, we do culture too. We also do, here's a book I wrote on culture. And so they started to try to reinvent themselves that way. So, I mean, I think that this is a kind of a realistic academic jostling.
Yeah, I mean, but I guess I would say that, like, I think it's like very much there from both sides. If you look at people who identify themselves as, members of this sort of nascent effort to write a history of the humanities, and if you look at sort of people who have identified themselves as historians of science, I think on both sides there's a perception that this current is geared towards dislodging the notion that the history of science has some special primacy. There's been this move in the history of science towards a much more ecumenical history of knowledge that comes from within the discipline itself, and that is very much geared towards moving away from the idea that, like, we need to, write histories of the king of the disciplines and of of physics and biology. And then on the history of the humanities side, there's an idea that, that history of science has had the limelight and done a lot of important work, and now it's time for some of the same tools to be brought to bear on the humanities. But I think really the goal here is to, again, to create kind of a unified picture that doesn't just clap the one hand of the humanities or clap the one hand of the other side of this very historicizable and contingent distinction, namely the natural sciences.
So where do you put mathematics?
Think carefully, Christian.
I mean, I guess I would say that, like, the thing about doing the history of the humanities is that, I don't really have to answer that. Like, you would go to the sources and see where the mathematicians place themselves. I mean, so, like, there's plenty of scholarship about, how, when Galileo decided to bring mathematics to bear, like, what kind of a quote unquote, a proto-disciplinary outsider did that make him? Or, how does the fact that, like, Copernicus was, like, presenting a mathematical model condition the reception of, of his work? I mean, so you basically, yeah.
I mean, I think it's a really good question. I think you're right. I mean, it's tough to answer. We could, like, just historians of the humanities and historians of science we can like roll dice and figure out.
Well, it's just when, where, how. I mean,
but I think also, like, you take something like the Riemann hypothesis or set theory or something like that. I mean, it's a product of the human mind, and not just that. I mean, there's somebody at Princeton right now who's writing a wonderful dissertation about how German intellectuals rediscovered mathematics, like late 19th century mathematics after the Second World War, in ways that have a lot more to do with the humanities, and it's basically nothing to do with the history of science, or not nothing, but less to do with the history of science. And so I think there's a solid argument to be made for the place of mathematics in the humanities.
I love that. I would love for math to be part of the humanities. So one of the things, and we're going to start wrapping things up here right now. So one of the things that the Institute for Humanities has also been trying to do, and Sally Hatch-Gray, who asked a great question about the history of science much earlier on that I think we've covered. One of the very first things, presentations that the Institute for Humanities gave once I took it over was her presentation on the philosophy of science in 19th century Germany, which you all have been talking about quite a good bit during this conversation. So I guess what I'd like to ask is now, kind of where do we go from here? Where should we go from here? Because right now, like, even just among my own students, I have lots of students who come to my office who are taking a survey class and who say, oh, Dr. Osmond, I have to drop your class. I'm sorry. I love your class. I want to be a historian, but I need to get a job. And I'm like, well, I'm being paid to do this. And even our local mathematician who's asking the math question, if he's in the humanities, he's asking if his salary is going to get cut. So, where do we go from here with this perceived division between STEM and the humanities? And that STEM will make a difference because it will discover, great things. And the humanities just sitting around twiddling your thumbs and talking about philology all day.
Mhm.
How do we do something material in our own universities to work with this?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely. I'll speak quickly to this in the pass the ball, but I think there's definitely room for advocacy here. I mean, there's a lot of big claims made about the relationship between STEM and history, or the relationship between STEM and the humanities, and about what sort of canon should and shouldn't be included in the humanities, and these claims are in large part, I think, made without the benefit of any really rigorous studies of the background. So it is incumbent upon someone who is interested in the history of the humanities to point that out and perhaps provide some support. I mean, there's definitely an opportunity for advocacy, is I guess the way that I would put it.
I would say, to add to that, for everybody involved or here, I mean, we live in such an interesting time when it comes to the shape of the humanities. And I would say the question isn't just, what can we do, but how is it that we can participate in the decision-making processes that are happening right now about what the humanities are going to look like. And the kind of classic example is a form of administrative interdisciplinarity where there's the Department of Philosophy and Art History or something like that, just simply because they want to cut down on the number of administrative workers and make a bunch of bigger departments out of smaller departments. And there's a lot of that that's going on at universities without necessarily even people having conversations about it. So a great example is I come from a language department, and there's a real question that's happening at basically every university right now about the extent to which they're going to cut back on language and what that's going to mean and what that's going to look like. And those assumptions, like people talk about the cuts when the cuts are made, but most of those decisions have been made a decade in advance. And there's a vision that somebody has and isn't necessarily advertising about what the university and what the humanities are going to look like. And so I think that, I would just say the where do we go from here? There are a lot of interesting ideas, and there are a lot of people who disagree about a lot of different things. And there's a lot of stuff that's happening right now in terms of where money is going, in terms of the kind of ideas that people are cooking up. But I just hope that the most important thing is that people are actively involved in conversations, and that decision-making, the decisions are being made with the inputs of the people who are the communities and the scholars who are actually going to be impacted by them.
Yeah, and I want to say something actually like pretty concrete and quickly. I mean, one of my favorite. There's a passage in sort of the biography of this famous 20th century physicist Richard Feynman, where he's graduating from MIT, and his father comes to MIT and is like, "My son wants to like keep studying and like get a physics PhD, and why the heck would he want to do that? And like, it's hard to get jobs. I don't understand what you're going to do with this, right?" At this time, the budgets for physics study are maybe in the tens of thousands. 5 years later, like 6 years later, Feynman's working on the atomic bomb, right? There's billions of dollars in these projects. Within 10 years, he's in a physics department that's being funded to the tune of millions, and physics are sought after. We're only about a century and a half removed from a time when on the Berlin streets you have pictures displayed, not just of like theater stars and natural scientists, but also of philologists and historians. So what I would say is that what the history of knowledge, as it were, tells us is that we are not very good at predicting what ways the terrain of the cartography of knowledge is going to shift. So, before you cut things or before you make rulings about, the way things are going to be based on the way things are, you have to think twice, because, tomorrow humanities might be what everyone's talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we even had an anthropologist come a few years ago who was trying to predict the next 5,000 years, and the essence, from an anthropological, very long history type of view. And he essentially said, yeah, you can't do that. Because the guy who invented fire was not imagining going to the moon, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but like that's the whole point, is that like to everyone, to those localized in a particular time and place, the way things are seems like the way things are going to be. But anything could happen. World War II, they had like Russian linguists like translating, military messages. You never know what's going to happen.
Well, I think we're living literally in one of these moments. It's amazing how much we have started using these new digital tools without really even thinking through what the implications are going to be for the practice of scholarship. So, we live in a world now where you have the most printed works published before 1900 at your fingertips, so you can access them immediately. You have the ability, in many cases, the manuscripts and primary sources are more easily accessible than the secondary literature about them.
Right.
Yeah.
And you have the ability to do projects that are based on multiple, a comparison between items on multiple archives, stuff that people back in the day would have had to spend just tens of thousands of dollars in reproductions to do.
Yes.
And you could do that, you pay nothing. And
The
grad
tectonic
students,
shift. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and it's huge. And we just have no idea what it's going to
What
look
it's going to do. Right. What it's going to do. So keep studying history and or English. Because who knows?
And or many of the other disciplines that make up the humanities.
Maybe the next generation of YouTube influencers will all be English scholars. We have no idea.
Well,
And
who
I
knows?
mean that quasi seriously.
I like that.
Well, interesting. It's funny. We were talking earlier before this program actually started about how when we were even going to start to define the humanities, we'd probably each talk for about 20 minutes and then say, yeah, so I don't know, because that's what scholars do, right? Like we pull out all of these possibilities and all these pieces of evidence and then go, yeah, I don't know. And so here we just had this hour plus long program where we're kind of like on what the future's, we don't know.
No, we've delivered not a single answer. Thank you for listening.
Well, we delivered a lot of answers, but lots and lots of different ways of putting them together. So I'm going to have to end things here. We have a few comments left in the chat that I haven't been able to go to, and Christian and Paul, I'm going to invite you, if you don't mind, to just take a look at those, and maybe if you see one or two that speak to something that you would like to answer, that you just go ahead and type a response for that. Thank you both for being here. Thank you to everyone who has joined us and who were patient with us a little earlier on, and for taking part in this fantastic conversation. So I think the lesson that we're taking away from all this is stay in this, because interesting and fascinating things are happening, and we have the
Read
opportunity
History
to
of the
shape what we're doing.
Humanities.
Read History of the Humanities. Go check out that journal. Check out that site that somebody put in the chat.
A plug for
Christian's
everybody,
work.
Julia.
Oh, yeah, I wish. Anyway, thank you all again very much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all next time. Oh, one last thing. There's an avatar that's floating around on our page right now. John, could you join us for just a minute? Everybody, this is John Burrow. This is my assistant. He has been in every single one of these conversations we've had online since COVID started. In fact, he was the one who engineered the possibility for us to start doing things like this. And John is the one who has made sure that the tech runs as smoothly as possible and has done a pretty darn good job of doing so. So if everyone could just kind of join me in, doing that kind of awkward silent clapping for John, all of you out there. He's really the one who has made most of these programs possible, and he just floats in the background for most of it. So I promised I'd embarrass him this time around and say thank you, John. And I'm sure everyone is saying thank you in the comments as well. And you would know that because you were following those comments and letting me know what they say as they go on. So on that note, it's been a wonderful season. Thank you all so much. Again, thank you, Christian and Paul, for joining us. Thank you, John, for making good things happen. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Thanks.